All right, so I got 7:05, so we're going to get started here. Thanks everybody for joining. This is Church History Vastly Oversimplified. This is a class that you can just hang out and listen to. There's no reading involved. Just try to, learn something, I guess, is my advice. I do have a plumber. We have like a big renovation going on for our kitchen. There's a plumber in my house somewhere, and he's still working on stuff. So if you hear banging in the background, he might just come by and ask me, where's the water shut off? I don't know. It could be wild. Just letting you know now, stuff might happen. But this is being recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded, turn your camera off and don't say anything. But I'm going to put this on YouTube afterwards so that folks that couldn't make the class are get a chance to see it. All right, let's get started. If anytime you want to ask a question, just feel free to come off mute, say something. That's fine. That's good with me. All right, how do I get you to work now? Okay. All right, so here's the overview. This is a 6-week class. We're going to do it every other week. We got 6 topics. They're right here: Constantine, Augustine, Christendom, the Reformation, 30 Years' War, and Revival Movement. Now, those are just the big topics. We're going to hit a lot more stuff than just those specific things, but that's kind of the big picture. The main book that I'm using, there is a book, Church History in Plain Language, if that shows up without being blurred. I've got the second edition. Apparently, the fifth edition is the current one. So that's if you want to read along. It's a really good book. It's a textbook. It's designed to be used by schools, so it's very non-controversial. I'll point out some places where it's takes some interesting choice of words. Let's just say that. Uh, but it's good because it boils down church history in about 500 pages. And if 500 pages blows your mind, which I mean it should, that's a lot of pages. Um, that is already simplifying a subject that is incredibly deep. This is a subject that you could fill an entire wall bookshelf with books on church history and still have room and more books to go. So this is a really deep topic. That's why the title of this is vastly oversimplified, because I am not going to do this justice. It's going to be way too oversimplified. But if you want a good book that summarizes the whole thing and it uses language that you and I can understand, Church History in Plain Language by Shelley is a good book. Highly recommend it. All right. I have to start with disclaimers because I'm an engineer, so I need disclaimers. First of all, I already said it, this is vastly oversimplified. So if you're looking for a depth, then you got to go somewhere else because this ain't going to do it because I don't have the time or the capability, which feeds into point 2. I am not an expert. I don't know what I'm talking about. I did not study this in school. I've just read a couple books and some other things. It's just something I'm interested in. So everything is wrong or your money back. That's my guarantee. All right. But feel free to ask me questions. If I was an expert, I'll probably tell you I don't know if you ask a good question. Throughout this, I will do my best to separate when I'm presenting what is my opinion versus what is a fact in air quotes, because when we're talking about history, especially the older the history is, the farther we get from what you can consider a fact. But there are historically accepted concepts that's what we're going to talk about. But things that are outside of that, I will try to do my best to say, hey, this is my opinion. This is just me thinking. So that's what I'm trying to do. All right, what else? Here's our overall timeline. We're You don't need to read everything on this as an eye chart. It's not meant for you to like study. Okay, so don't worry about it. If you're like trying to read it, you're like, I see everybody like, okay, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. We'll get there. I'm going to zoom in when we get to parts, but I just want to show the whole thing to start with. We're starting at about 180. And that's where when approximately James the younger, or not John the younger, John the beloved disciple, that's approximately when people think that he died. So he's the last apostle. That's when the last apostle dies. That's where we're going to pick up the story. So we're not talking about anything that happens in Acts or the apostolic period while the apostles are alive. We're not talking about Jesus or anything that's in the Gospels. We're picking up the story after John dies, and that starts what's called the post-apostolic period. And today we're going to cover from the post-apostolic into Constantine. But this whole class, over the next 6 classes, we're going to go all the way up until the Industrial Revolution, probably about um, the American Civil War. That's probably going to be the point where we stop around the 1860s. That'll be the end of what we're going to talk about. So there's a lot going on in there. That's why this is vastly oversimplified. And if you're looking at this chart going, man, Tom, you missed a spot. Yeah, there's a big gap, and we're not going to talk about it. Sorry. There's stuff going on there, but I don't have the time to tell you about it. It's very interesting things. You should go read some books. It's my recommendation. Okay, part one. Here we go. Constantine. That's the subject today. There's the timeline. We're picking up from about 100 AD. Post-apostolic church period is about from 100 to about 312. And 313 is when Constantine shows up on the scene. And that's who we're going to talk about today. All right. You guys with me? I see nods. All right. Post-apostolic church. So you've got the church. It's founded. We often say that in Acts chapter 2, that's when the church was founded. Pentecost, Peter preaches the first sermon. Then there's the apostolic period. That's when the apostles are in charge of the church. And you can read about it in Acts. You can read about what's going on. There's a little bit up into some other history outside of the Bible. It talks about it. And when the last apostle dies, now you have the post-apostolic period. And that's, of course, John's the last apostle. And that's where we're picking up the story. Okay. So first of all, let's talk about the church. What did this church look like? What did they believe? What did they practice? This is something that I want to talk about because this is something that's going to evolve. So I'm going to try to return to this throughout the class and talk about, okay, here's what's going on. Here's what's changed. Here's why it's changed. So that's kind of really one of the main points of the class. I find this topic interesting because I look at our world today and I'm like, what the heck, man? There's like 8 bajillion different people that call themselves Christian. They all got a different concept of how to become a Christian, what it means to be a Christian, how to stay a Christian, if you can even stay a Christian or not. And how? And so that's the goal of the class, is to really try to, what I want to do is paint a picture that shows this flow of history. There's a story that flows, and this influences that, and that influences the other thing. And then by the end, we should see kind of the world that we have today. So that's the goal, is to start with this post-apostolic church at the very end where you should see the world that we live in today. And so to start there, though, we got to talk about some doctrine. First of all, the salvation was by faith, as it says in Romans. They believed that salvation was by faith. It was about the life that you lived. It wasn't just a thought. It was a lifestyle. And it started at baptism. That was the starting point of your faith walk. And it was, and I put this in air quotes, adults. Adults were converted because it was a conversion. That's the really important thing to zero in on this doctrine, is that you had to choose to become a Christian. You had to take action to become a Christian. And that might sound stupid, but foreshadowing, that's not always going to be the case. So adult conversion. And when I say adult, I have spent the last 20 years trying to figure out, I've been looking for resources, I've been looking for texts that talk about the early church's concept of what was this age of conversion. And I found nothing. I can't find a thing. And if you have something, please tell me. I want a book. I want a resource. I want something I point to and say, hey, this scholar says this. Because I can't find anything. I've asked lots of people. The best answer that I've gotten from Chris Schwarzenberger, if you guys know Chris, he leads a church in Spokane. Good buddy of mine. He's way smarter than I am. And he says that it was Constantine that was the first to kind of propose the idea of infants being baptized. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm going to go with Chris, though, because it's like, disagreeing with my wife. My wife's always right. So when we disagree, I just go with her. I'm going to go with Chris because I'm sure he's right and I'm wrong if I disagree. So I think at this point, now what was an adult? I don't know. My guess, and this is again Tom's opinion, my guess was that the early church followed the Jewish tradition. And we know for Jewish tradition, bar mitzvah at 13. That was the age where somebody became an adult. So my guess, just totally spitballing here, is that the early church probably followed the Jewish tradition, and at 13 or somewhere around there was probably the age where people were considered adult enough to get converted to Christianity. But again, if you have references that talk about this, please send them to me. I would love to read them because I don't know. It's a conversion by choice. There is no forced conversion. The idea of converting at the sword is, of course, absurd to the early Christians at this post-apostolic church. Foreshadowing. Won't always be that way. They had a very, very high standard of personal behavior. Their concept of righteousness they inherited from the Jews. The Jews had a very high standard of personal righteousness compared to the world around them. Compared to the Roman standard, oh my goodness, it was night and day different. And one thing that I really like to point out is this was something that they held the church to. And if you weren't meeting this standard of righteousness, then you could be disciplined. You could be kicked out of the church until you repented. But there were 4 things that they had that if you committed these things at all, you're out. And there's no coming back. Like this is permaban. Okay. Adultery, murder, which I mean, I hope that didn't come up very often, but I mean, it's on the list. Heresy, and this is like not like you just have some random thought one day and you're talking to your buddy like, oh, hey, I had this thought. What if, I don't know, what if Jesus wasn't really God, right? That's not really heresy. Like, yeah, it's a heretical thought, but if your bishop or your uh, church leader comes to you and says, hey, yeah, that's not right, and you're like, oh, okay, fine. That's not committing like heresy. Like heresy is like you come up with a weird idea or you hear somebody else's weird idea and you are trying to teach it to others and you don't let it go. That's what I'm talking about. That kind of a heresy is what would get you excommunicated. And finally, apostasy. Now, what's apostasy? It's a fancy word for saying you worship something other than God. Now, hopefully you see the problem right there. Because if you know anything about this period of history, you know that at this time in the Roman Empire, every person who lived in the empire was required to do what? Worship the emperor. That was legally required. So automatically, like it's not that Christianity was necessarily illegal. It was the fact that if you wanted to be a Christian, you had to break the law. So that's a problem. And if you did this, if you committed apostasy, you're done and you're not coming back. There was no second chance. It was just, you're done. Bye. Burning a little pinch of incense and say Caesar is Lord. Gone. Permaban. Not coming back. Like, hardcore. What I'm trying to get at is these guys were hardcore. They didn't mess around. They had a high standard of personal righteousness. They held each other to a high standard, and there were things that you could get kicked out for good to keep that standard high. All right, so what shaped this post-apostolic church? 2 things. Well, probably more than 2, but 2 really big things that did a lot to shape it. Number 1 is heresies. Number 2 is persecution. All right, so let's talk about heresies for a second. So first of all, the Bible isn't formed yet. The church had, of course, the Tanakh, which is like what we call the Old Testament. It's like the Jewish literature. The Jewish scriptures were, of course, a part of the church. They had all the parts that we call the New Testament. They had the letters. They had the histories. They had everything. They have everything that we have today that's in the New Testament. They also had some other things like the Shepherd of Hermes or something like that. There's a couple other extra biblical sources that they often used as part of church services that eventually became not part of the Bible. Now, does that mean that they're teaching horrible things? No, it just means that somebody decided that when they formed the Bible, they had a set of criteria that said, okay, if you want to be part of the canonical scriptures, you have to meet this, and this. And some of these things didn't meet like one of those things. And so they were just excluded. They were still used in worship for years afterwards, but eventually just the canonical Bible kind of became the thing. That's all I'm going to say about the forming of the Bible. I know church history, and we're not going to talk about how the Bible is formed. It's a fascinating subject. And if you want your faith built, go study it. It's great. There's a whole chapter in this book, Church History in Plain Language. It happens in like the late 300s, early 400s. I can't remember exactly when they kind of canonize it, but it's going to be outside of the time frame that we're talking about for the first class. Okay, so the first class, they still don't have a Bible totally canonized at the end of this, but that's one of the problems. That's one of the issues they have is they had the Old Testament scriptures and they have a whole bunch of letters and a bunch of other things, but they're not considered like scripture. They're considered as very weighty and they use them, but they didn't have this like completely blessed. This is it. You can stand on this. This is acceptable. So that led to one of the reasons why there were a lot of heresies. The other thing is, like, what are we talking about? We're talking about the entire Jewish Old Testament story, and then you tack onto that a Jewish rabbi who's executed, crucified, raises from the dead, and then you've got crazy talk about baptism and forgiveness of sins, and also this is a really complicated subject. So if you had a question, if you could basically question anything in that story, was Jesus really God or was he just a man? Was he not a man at all and just some sort of spirit? Did he die or did he not really die? Did he just look like he died? Did he kind of die but not like, Princess Bride die, like dead but not really dead? Miracle Max brought him back. I don't know. Like, if you have a question that you could come up with, somebody had that during this post-apostolic period and probably argued it as like, no, Jesus really was just a spirit. Like that was a heresy, and they had to have the whole church had to argue over it and come to a conclusion that no, Jesus was fully man and fully God at the same time. These are the things that are being hashed out, and there were a million heresies. Sorry, I'm getting over my cold from last week. There's a million heresies. They're fascinating. The decisions that were made, how they made them. Go read some history about it. I'm not going to go through every single one. We are going to talk about a few, but we're not going to go through every one. Christianity is not happening in a vacuum. A lot of what's this early Christian church is happening in what's today Greece, Rome. There's a lot of philosophy. Philosophy is a big deal. And so there are Gnostics, there's Stoics, there's asceticism. There are all sorts of other kinds of philosophies. And what you have are people both inside the church and outside the church who are making an effort to take their favorite philosophy, like Gnosticism, and meld it with Christianity to make some sort of Gnostic Christianity. And so, sorry, I need some water. Over and over again, there's a lot of these heresies have to do with no, get your Gnosticism out of my Christianity. It doesn't belong here. It's not there. Um, But one of the things that happens because they have to, how do they deal with these? How do they deal with these heresies? Well, they did it by committee, basically. They basically followed the Acts Council of Jerusalem kind of model. Like we read about that, and I think it's Acts 9, 10, something like that, where there's the Gentiles are being baptized, and um, Paul and Barnabas go to Jerusalem, and they're like defending how they're what they're teaching to these new Christians, to the Gentiles, and they basically meet. They come to a decision via consensus, right? It's the big church leaders who have more say than others, but it's still kind of a consensus based. Oh, dying. So the early church had a structure that was similar in that there was the leadership. There was no one person who was in charge of a church. There was no one person in charge of all of the churches. It was sort of decentralized. So most churches, if you were, pick a city, they were very geographic. If you were in a church in a city, there would be an elders, like a group of elders, and they kind of helped lead the church. They mostly dealt with discipline and internal issues. There were more of like a clergy. There were evangelists. There were teachers. There were deacons. There were all these different roles, and there was a very structured way how people became Christians. And I'll try to talk about that a little bit later. But early on, there was no one person in charge of a whole church. So if you were the church of, Antioch, There was no like leader of the Church of Antioch. It was done kind of by consensus. The churches themselves, when they needed to deal with like a heresy or some other issue that affected all the churches, they would gather together. They would send point a representative from each church, and they would meet somewhere, and they would hash it out and try to decide by consensus. So this person that they would appoint to go to these committee meetings, they had to be intelligent, they had to know their scriptures really well, and they had to have really good interpersonal and diplomatic skills. So in modern talk, you might say that's like CEO material, right? That's leadership material. That's somebody who naturally is going to be good at leading a church. So over time, not overnight, but over time, they gave this person who was appointed to be a representative of a church while they met to discuss something, that ended up with a title called the bishop, which I believe comes from the Greek for shepherd. And over time, the bishop's role actually became the leader of that church. So it went from a decentralized leadership to a centralized leadership in the position of the bishop. And that bishop represented that church whenever there was a meeting of other churches. Now, at this time, there still isn't like one bishop to rule them all. Okay. So, like, when the bishops would meet to talk about something, the bishops from the bigger cities had more influence. So it wasn't an equal representation thing, but it was still by consensus. Foreshadowing. Okay, so the other big thing, persecution. This is a lovely picture. I want to talk about this picture for a minute. It's a famous picture. That the old dude in the middle. I don't know if you guys can see my mouse. I probably have a way to do I don't know. There's some way to make my mouse show up, but I don't know how to do it. Anyway, standing dude in the middle with the white robe, that's Polycarp. And he was a leader in I don't remember where. I can't remember. But he was a bishop. He was leader of a church. This is in like 155, I think, is when he was executed. That's an arena full of people, whole probably thousands of people watching these Polycarp and some of his followers, some of these Christians. You can see women, children. Yeah, they're being fed to lions. There are lions and tigers coming out of the arena floor, and these people are gathered to watch these animals rip these people to shreds. No weapons, they have no chance. This is entertainment for our ancient forebears. Now you'll also notice there's like a ring in the back. If you notice in the back of the painting, along the edges of this arena, there are people being crucified. And they have been on the cross for who knows? I mean, I don't know if you know much about crucifixion, but it could take days to kill somebody using crucifixion. So I don't know if these people were crucified that morning, if they've been there for hours, if they were just crucified. I don't know. But the other thing is if you look left to right, they're being lit on fire. So you have people being torn to shred by lions. You have people being crucified, and then just to top that off, let's light them on fire as well. So persecution, not fun. War crimes aplenty. But this wasn't everyday life. Okay. For most of the time, nothing happened. Okay, so persecution was this thing that just kind of popped up every once in a while, and it could go from being mild to very intense, but it tended to be short periods of time where before and in between there's really nothing going on. Because really, what law are you breaking? Well, you're not worshiping the emperor. And you could just bribe somebody if you wanted to get out of that. You could just ignore it and hope that nobody cares, because usually, just like today, it's like the analogy I like is, you ever been on the freeway, right? You're driving down the freeway and you're going a little over the speed limit, but you know what? You're going the same speed as everybody else on the road. And you pass that state patrolman out there with his like laser radar, whatever, right? You're breaking the law. He's caught you. Does he come after you? No, because he's waiting for that crazy person that, oh my gosh, please go get that guy. I hate that guy. That's kind of like what it was like. The officials had way more important things to do than deal with people not worshiping the emperor. So most of the time they just ignored it. It didn't matter. However, because Christians were a minority, they were weird because they didn't follow the culture, they didn't worship, like much of the culture was embedded in day-to-day life, was embedded in paganism. You went to the market, you burned incense to a god of whatever as you entered the market. You went to work, well, you're a leather maker. Well, you'd pray to the god of, or sacrifice to the god of leather makers, right? Like you went home and you took the trash out, you burned incense to the god of whoever took the trash out. I don't know. I don't think there was a god of trash taking out. But the point is, like, throughout your day, you were constantly doing some sort of pagan worship. So these guys didn't do that at all. And so they were really weird. They were thought as atheists. They were called atheists because they didn't do all of this worship, even though they obviously weren't atheists. Um, they were the marginalized of society, if you will. Okay. And so the Christians then made easy scapegoats. So usually when persecution would break out is when something bad happened. Crops failed, disease, earthquake. Whose fault is this? Politicians were quick to say, "Oh, well, it's obviously not my awesome leadership that caused that famine. No, it must be those weird Christians. They don't worship the gods, so it's obviously the gods that are angry at us. So let's go get the Christians." And I am so glad that we live in an advanced society where our politicians would never blame and scapegoat the marginalized of society to cover for their own. I'm just going to pause and let that sarcasm really marinate because that's some high quality social commentary right there. You didn't know you were getting that when you signed up for this, did you? All right, but persecution, what did it look like? You could go, it was everything from you could be just fined, like, hey, 10 drachmas or whatever. Don't do it again. To death. Like, pick, exhibit A on the screen, right? Fed to lions, burned at the stake while being crucified. That sounds like fun. So everything in between, torture, um, losing businesses and property, everything could happen. But one of the things, the consequences is that it drove Christians into community. You can imagine this picture for a second. Imagine you're a member of that church where Polycarp was leading. And it's the next time that you got together with the other Christians midweek or whatever. I don't know what they called it, but we call it midweek. They called it who knows what. What are you talking about at that midweek? Like you're talking about whose kids lost their parents, right? You're talking about, you know, who needs to like take in some orphans. You're talking about what widows were made and how are we going to take care of them. Are you talking about politics? Are you having some disagreement between with your brother about like what kind of songs we sing at the worship? No. You depended on each other because that's what persecution really did, is it drove the people to rely on each other and really rely on God. You can read the scriptures where the letters where they're like, I know you're suffering, I know you're going through persecution. Rely on God. That's what it really means. All right, let you think about that. Okay, so all the persecutions were just warm-up acts, though, until Diocletian. So that's lovely, Diocletian right there, emperor. He was emperor of Rome. He was one of the really good emperors of Rome. Good as in like competent. The empire did really well while he was in charge. He was known for being a very tolerant ruler. So for the vast majority of his rule, he basically ignored Christians. And the rumor was he had a wife that was a Christian, and he had high members of his high officials in his government and high military officials in the military who were Christians. And it wasn't a deal until suddenly it was. And in 303, nobody knows why. It's been completely lost to history. Diocletian just loses it, and he just no more Christians. He unleashes a persecution that has never been seen before or since. He tries to eradicate Christianity. Massive death. It goes through, he dies in, I don't remember, 310 or something like that. And then his appointed follower Galerius was like the next emperor. He continued the same practice, and it was under Galerius that it got so bad Okay, understand this. It got so bad that the pagans were the ones crying out for it to stop. Those people who are sitting in the arena rooting for the animals to rip those women and children to death, those people are the ones that said, that's too much. So imagine how bad it was. Okay, really bad. That's what I'm trying to get at. Really bad persecution breaks out, unlike any others, and it finally ends in 313. I'm going to take a little side topic and talk about saints, not the New Orleans saints. These kinds of saints. All right. Yeah. Thank you. I see you. So the New Orleans saints. No, these kinds of saints are, I want to talk about saints. So saints originally was a title that was used to just describe Christians. You can read it in Romans 1:7 in the NASB version. It says, to all who are beloved of God in Rome, called as saints. In other translations, it's like those loved by God or those who love God or something like that. It's not always translated as saint. Um, Maybe because of how people changed the term, but anyways, uh, that was originally what it meant. It just meant Christians. But later in the post-apostolic period, it started to become reserved for super Christians. And what I mean by super Christians are just Christians who were like great examples and lived very great lives and did great things for the kingdom of God, that kind of thing. But then later it evolved to be reserved for martyrs. So when the persecutions really start hitting and people start dying as martyrs, um, that's when this term was reserved for martyrs. So the saints were people who were martyred for God. And the churches would actually remember your name and your martyrdom date, and they would celebrate it. So when your anniversary of your martyrdom would come around, the church would remember you. They would as part of like the service or something, they would say, "Hey, let's all take a moment and remember Saint Anne." Everybody remember Saint Anne? She was so great, man. Remember, she was such a good cook. Everybody loved her cooking. We love Saint Anne. Oh, and don't forget about Saint Joe. I don't think they had Joes then, but I can't think of a good name. So I'm thinking of Joe. So you guys remember Saint Joe? He was such a good handyman. He could fix anything, and if you had something broken, he could fix it. Like that's kind of like how they would remember and keep the memory of these people who were martyred, and they called them as saints. Um, Foreshadowing. That's important because it's not going to stay that way. All right. We're finally, how many minutes in? 37 minutes in. We're finally to the subject of today's lesson, Constantine. So all of that is just foreshadowing to try to lay the groundwork for what the church was like, what the environment was like. Hardcore, focused group of Christians dealing with persecution. One other quick thing I wanted to say about persecution. What would happen after persecution? During times of persecution, the church would shrink because not only are people getting killed, but you'd also have people leave the church. Like there were people who would when they're under torture or when their wife or child was about to be executed, they said, "Okay, okay, hold on. I'll offer a pinch and claim Caesar's Lord." And when they did that, great. You're no longer being persecuted and you're no longer a Christian because the church kicks you out and they will not let you back. So the church would shrink under persecution. But amazingly, after persecution ended, the church would grow in leaps because you would have all of these people who knew their neighbors or whatever that were Christians and they were kind of weird, but whatever. They would see them stand up against this persecution. And they were like, why just worship the emperor? Why is this so important to you? And they would see how they would love each other and treat each other and take care of each other. And it would get them interested in wanting to see what this whole thing was about. And so the church would actually grow and usually would be larger than it was before the persecution started after a persecution. Just a thing to remember. Okay, Constantine. That's his lovely mug right there. There was some giant marble statue that it was broken, but they still have pieces of it. You can go find this. It's in some museum somewhere. I don't know. I'm not very useful, am I? Constantine. Okay. Let me give you the official story of Constantine, okay? Start with official story. So this is all church approved, like Catholic Church approved, okay? First of all, let's talk about the Roman Empire. Rome started as a republic after Julius Caesar in like, I don't know, was it 50 BC, something like that. He basically overthrew the government and became an emperor. And after that, it was just emperors. Now, the problem with the Roman Empire is the same with all autocratic societies is what do you do when the leader dies? What about how do you deal with succession? Because if you're an autocratic ruler who came to power by taking it from somebody else, you know what your one focus in life is? Making sure somebody doesn't do that to you, right? So you can't let competent, intelligent, charismatic, powerful people exist. Like you stomp out competence because you have to be the only competent person. So when you kick the bucket, oftentimes there's a big power vacuum left and there are no competent people to fill it, and so it's this like big fight. And that's one of the problems the Roman Empire had. Sometimes they would pass on peacefully, and there'd be like competent emperor to competent emperor, but oftentimes, like it was with Diocletian, Galerius was not a good emperor, and he was not popular, and he was deposed very quickly. And when he was deposed, that left the door open, and usually it was the Roman generals, the generals that were in charge of legions, that had an army at their back, that was loyal to them. These were people who were intelligent, great leaders, charismatic. They had all the skills to be an emperor. So that's usually where the emperors came, was from the army. And after Galerius dies, there's a civil war that basically breaks out there, and it boils down to two guys, Maxentius and Constantine. Maxentius has the bigger army. Constantine is just smarter. So they come to a battle. They're outside of Rome, okay? And there's a battle of the Filivian Bridge or something like that. You can go see the bridge today; it still exists. You can go see where this battle happened. And the day before the battle, Constantine's outside and he sees in the sky, shining through the light, he sees a sign in the sky, and it looks like what's called a rochi. I think it's called rochi. I think it's rochi. And it's that symbol on the screen there. It's the first two. It's the first two Latin letter or Greek letters of Christos. So if you spell out Christos, which is Christ, it starts with like the Greek letters rho and chi. Anyway, or is it chi and rho? I don't remember. Point is, he sees this sign. Here's a voice tell him, in this sign, conquer. And so he takes this to mean the God of the Christians is saying, hey, you're my man. You're going to go win tomorrow. Go use this symbol on your stuff and you're going to win. So he goes and tells his troops, like, hey, everybody go and put this sign on your shields and on banners. And don't worry about tomorrow because, man, I got the God of the Christians. He said, I'm going to do it. We're going to win. So he fights his battle and he beats Maxentius on 20th October 312. And after that, he marches into Rome, crowns himself emperor, and he's the next emperor of Rome. And he was a really good emperor. He was really smart. Not good in like morality, good as in like competent. Okay. That's the official story, right? And this, if the Catholic Church says this ushers in the era of the Catholic Roman Empire. Now, there's reasons to doubt this story because it was written by the victors, right? When history's written by the victors, you always got to be a little nervous about it, right? So first of all, but in order to tell this story, first you got to understand a little subject called emperor cults. Okay, this is a little fun little nuance that when I learned about it, I was like, wow, this is cool. Okay, emperor cults. So in the emperor period of the Roman Empire, if when an emperor became emperor after he was coronated, he would then pick a religion in the empire somewhere um, to be his religion, his cult, and it was usually something that was really, really obscure, not a mainstream religion. This was like some 10 people out in the corner of nowhere and the very edge of the fringe of the empire. That's how many people, it was tiny and it was weird. The weirder the things that they did to worship, the better. So he would pick some weird, obscure religion. He would claim the title Pontifex Maximus, which just means chief priest in Latin, chief priest. And then he would practice these weird, how they worshipped in this religion, this cult. He would practice that as the chief priest. But here's the deal. He only did this in private. And he only invited his closest people and most trusted people to be a part of it. So if you were invited in to join the emperor's cult, you were in. Like you were in. Like you are in the inner circle of the inner circle. Okay. Like you have made it in society if you were in the emperor's cult. Okay. That was a sign of favor. It was a sign of you're on the inside. Okay. So what's weird is that Constantine, on the night before the battle, he brings in all of his closest military leaders. He would have had all these people who were supporting him, like rich and powerful people who were supporting him financially or with supplies or with food to feed his army and take care of it, right? Why? Why were these people doing that? Because as soon as he became emperor, there was a whole lot of job openings that just opened up all over the empire. And for some bizarre reason in this, autocratic society, if you had certain jobs, your income was strangely much higher than what your wage was. Wink, wink, right? Like there was all kinds of room for getting rich off of corruption. And so if you wanted one of these jobs, you had to know the emperor. You had to be in with the emperor. And so all these people who are supporting Constantine, they're basically playing a really high stakes bet. And they're like, I'm gambling on you. You're the horse that's going to win. But if he does win, they get to cash in, right? They're going to call in that favor and get something that's going to either help them financially or personally or politically or whatever, right? So in this battle, before the battle, the night before, after he's had this vision, allegedly, he gathers all of these supporters, all these hanger-ons, all these people who are looking to gain off of him winning, and he says, I have selected my emperor cult. It's Christianity. Now, this is really weird because A, he's not emperor yet, and B, usually you hand pluck just your close. He's inviting everybody to be part of his emperor cult. Now, why would he do that, you might ask? Well, let me throw my opinion at you that this was just a big loyalty test. Because what's in it for Constantine, for this whole like become emperor thing? This battle the next day, he's either going to win and become emperor or he's dead. Those are the two options. Like there is no other option here. There's no way he walks away from this, either emperor or he's dead. So for him, he's got all the skin in the game, right? But what about his military leaders? What about these people that are supporting him financially? What happens if he loses? The military leaders, if you're a centurion, for example, those are not a dime a dozen. A really experienced, good leader of a Roman army, that's a valuable person. So if they survive the battle and they just, pledge loyalty to you and your army, then hey, I just gained a really experienced soldier, right? They are valuable. So they're not just going to be like executed because that's a valuable commodity. What about the people who are supporting him financially? Well, they're just going to be on the, not on, they're not going to be getting Christmas cards from the new emperor, but they're probably just going to get away, scot free. Like they're not going to get any beneficial treatment, but that's about it. But what Constantine's saying is he's like, hey, you guys want that job? You want that promotion? You want that, kickback job? You better support me now before the battle. You need to declare that you're part of my cult. You're on my team. Because now what happens if they lose? Now they're a confessed Christian. They are not nearly as getting off scot-free. There could be consequences. So what it does is it helps up their skin in the game and makes it so that they are a lot more motivated for him to win the next day than they were before. I think this is brilliant. And again, this is all my opinion, but I'm right, so it's okay. Now, the other piece is, first of all, he never converted. And this is not, legally, I have to say this is my opinion. It's not my opinion. This is true. He never converted, okay? He didn't, like, the way you became a Christian in the post-apostolic period, there was a whole process. It was consistent across the empire. It was everybody did this. There was the church structure was built around this. If you wanted to become a Christian, you first had to know somebody and talk to them and like, hey, I'm interested in becoming a Christian. And they would have you they would meet with you with some other people from the church whose job it was to kind of like check people out because it's illegal, sort of. So, they're trying to keep it a little, it wasn't really on the down low. They knew who everybody was. But they would feel you out. They would meet with you. Why do you want to become a Christian? What are you interested in? Why? They want to make sure they're not just some crazy person or whatever, that they're actually serious. So then, if you were serious, then they would actually start doing what we would consider Bible studies. They would have classes that were like you individually, and they would try to like start teaching you some of the basics and start teaching you and basically get you to start the process of repentance. So repentance was expected of you to start the process. And once you had started to show repentance in your life, then you were allowed to go to church. But church had two parts. The first part was prayer, singing, prayer, more singing, prayer. There was a lot of prayer. And then there would be like some sort of like we would consider a sermon. Like they would have a text, Old Testament, New Testament. They didn't have the New Testament yet, but they had the script, they had the letters and things. So they would read from them and talk about them. There was a lesson, and then more prayer, and then maybe more singing, but then more prayer. Then they would kick out all the non-Christians, all the people who weren't baptized. And they would say, okay, bye. Thanks for having us. See you. Hopefully see you next week. And then they would have what they called the love feast, or we'd call communion. They would have sit down, all the members of the church, the baptized members of the church would then meet. They would have bread, they would have wine, they would do what we call the communion, and they would eat a meal. And it wasn't just a cracker. Like, no, they would have bread and wine and they would eat a meal. And it was a communal meal, and it was where they would talk and they would have fellowship, and it was yeah, and that was reserved just for the Christians. And so once you had then studied and gone along far enough, then you could get baptized, then you could be part of the church fully. So that was the whole process. Constantine did none of that, okay? None of that. He did not repent. He did not get baptized. He did not pass go, and he did not collect $200. Now, to say he didn't repent is not quite true. He's got a really interesting life story. Um, but for the vast majority of it, he lived his life as a Roman emperor, unrepentant. He used power to suppress others. He was all about, climbing on the backs of others to get where he wanted. He had a Roman culture mindset, not a Christian one, not a Jesus mindset at all. However, there's this crazy story, and I think I have time for it. We're almost out of time. Okay, I think we got time for it. So he's married. When he becomes emperor, he's married. He has a son. He's raising his son to be like his, um, to take over for him when he dies, right? He's training him to be the next emperor. Well, at some point, he decides he wants to trade in original wife for new wife, right? Hot new wife. So he divorces his wife, marries hot new young thing. Hot new young thing has a son. And now hot new young thing says one day, his son his oldest son now is like 15, 16 years old, something like that. She says that he sexually assaulted her in, the most awful way. And I want to put this on YouTube at some point, so I'm not going to say it because I know YouTube filters for things. So bad stuff. She claims. And Constantine, in a rage, has his son just like executed on the spot, basically. Now, original wife hears this, and she's like, "You idiot! Like you grade A 100% USDA moron. Don't you see that she lied? She is setting up her son to be the heir. She just got your other son out of the way. Like she lied, you moron." And Constantine's like, "Oh, yeah, maybe." So he has new wife tortured until she confesses. And then in a rage, he has her executed. And at the end of the day, he's standing there and he realizes that in his anger, he's just destroyed everything that he loved. And he's just broken. And this is where he finally repents. His sin catches up to him, and he actually has a moment where I think first he may have had a nervous breakdown, but he eventually did repent. He actually repented. He actually, um, you know, did actually chill out. And then later in his life, he's still not baptized, by the way. never baptized. Then he's on his way to a war somewhere when he's in like his 50s or 60s. He's not that old. And he gets sick, and it's like a really serious sickness. So he goes back to Constantinople, his like, new capital. And on his deathbed, supposedly the official story is that he was super repentant. He refused to wear any of the Roman emperor gown or robe. He wore simple like sackcloth. Supposedly he totally repented of his life. And the story is he got baptized and then he died. There is an alternative take on this that he actually died. And right after he died, the Bishop of Constantinople baptized his dead body really quick to say, "Oh, look, he's baptized! Look, he totally got baptized before he died." No, really, guys, don't worry about it. He got baptized before he died. Um, I don't know what's true. Nobody really knows for sure, but that's the rumor, is that it may have just been a scam. Anyway, but my point is, he was not a Christian, especially at the time that he became emperor. And for the vast majority of his emperorship, he maybe, possibly at the very end of his life, repented and got baptized. And, maybe we'll see him in heaven someday and we can ask him about it. And he has some great stories to tell us, but we don't know. But while he was the vast majority of his life, he was absolutely not a Christian man. Okay, just to be clear. There's that. There's this whole loyalty test, the emperor's cult thing. I already talked about that. And then there's this. The other thing is that Roman soldiers are incredibly superstitious. Okay. So Roman soldiers were known for, they had all these rituals that they would do before a battle. They would cut open a chicken and look at the contents of its stomach, and somehow they would be able to figure out if they're going to win or lose. Like, it was weird stuff, right? But they were famously superstitious. This whole chi rho symbol thing, by saying, "Hey guys, don't worry about those other signs or whatever in the chicken stomach. Look, I had a vision from the God of the Christians, and he says, put this symbol on your stuff and we're going to win." And in my opinion, that was a really, really smart move to try to like get around their superstition and turn their superstition into a strength, to get them to think that, hey, the God of the Christians is on our side, so we're going to win. Now, that's really important because remember, he's got a Roman legion going against a Roman legion. The soldiers are the same. They have the same training. They have the same equipment. They have the same tactics. So, and he's outnumbered. Constantine went into this battle outnumbered, so he was probably going to lose. Like if there was like, ESPN's like a win probability graph, he would have started the match at, 60-40, he was going to lose, right? So I think, my opinion, that this whole chi rho symbol thing was all about trying to get superstition on his side and help give him a morale boost to help win the battle, which, spoiler alert, it worked. Okay. What are the consequences of Constantine? All right. I believe this is my last slide. So we're going to pick up here in 2 weeks. Okay. But you have a little bit of homework, very little. First of all, Christianity is immediately made legal, right? There is no requirement anymore to worship the emperor because, of course, Constantine is a Christian. At least, he's Pontifex Maximus, chief priest, right, of the Christians. So there is no more persecution ever. Okay. That's kind of a big deal. Think about that. That's your homework, by the way. Think about that. What does that do to the church? But just that. What are the consequences of that? Okay. He calls himself the Pontifex Maximus. He claims to be the chief priest, the head of the Christian church. Now, to his credit, he was, again, I think Constantine was like a brilliant man. Brilliant man. My opinion is he saw this pattern in the Roman Empire where it was like civil war after civil war after civil war. He could see the empire decaying. It was falling apart. It got weaker and weaker every time a new emperor was elected, and they had these, or not elected, but every time there was a war and the Romans were fighting each other to see who was going to be the top dog, that was weakening the empire. And he saw that, and he saw that it was causing division in society. And so, my opinion, I think Constantine was really smart. I think he saw Christianity as a way to unify the empire. I think he saw Christianity as a way. So he wanted to promote this as a kind of social glue to help the empire stay knit together, even though there's all these like civil wars and stuff going on. I think he was also trying to end the civil wars, but he didn't have a good plan for that. But the other thing is, so he claims this title of Pontifex Maximus, but he's very clear to the Christian leaders, to the Christian church leaders, the bishops who are leading the churches, and says, look, I promise you, as Pontifex Maximus, you let me claim this title. I promise you, I will not make any judgments on doctrine. I will not use this position to dictate any church anything, basically. He says I only want to use my position to do one thing, and that is to enforce unity. He was, which is another reason I think he was trying to use Christianity as a unifying factor, is because he was obsessed with the idea of the church being unified. So whenever there was a disagreement in the church, from here going forward, for the next like several decades, when there's like a heresy that breaks out, Constantine's the one who's telling the bishops, hey, you guys need to come to my palace. And by the way, I'm going to give you Roman soldier escorts, and you're going to be at my palace with me, and we're going to hang out here until you guys come to a conclusion. And you're not leaving. Which, if I was one of these bishops, I might be thinking, like, oh, gee, all expense paid trip to the emperor's palace. Gee, I think we might have to really hash this out, guys. This might take a while. Okay, just letting you know right now. This might take a few months. But I'm a bad person. So anyway, but the point is, you have this crazy switch from, instead of the Roman soldiers going out house to house, dragging these bishops out so they can like torture and murder them. Instead, you have these bishops being escorted by soldiers to an emperor's palace, where they are guarded by the emperor's finest guards, the Praetorian Guard, which is the best soldiers in the entire Roman army, are guarding you, and you're living in the lap of luxury, and you're eating the emperor's food, and you're, in order to like hash out to come to a consensus on something. So, to Constantine's credit, he never used this as something to influence the church other than to enforce unity. So he's really an actor of a positive actor in the church in that sense. And finally, last thing I'm going to talk about, then we can wrap this up because I'm 2 minutes over. The last thing he does, he moves the capital to Constantinople. He actually builds the city of Constantinople. Now, that's why this map is here, and I'm sorry that it's not the world's best map, but it does show the time period of Constantine. So Rome, I'm going to figure this out. There's probably a way to turn on spotlight. All right, you guys see the mouse? Yeah, just not. Yeah, awesome. Thank you. So here's Rome. We all know our geography lesson for the day. There's Rome. That's where the empire started. That's where it all grew out of. That's the center, kind of geographically. But it is not the center economically and from a population distribution perspective. Because Italy is a well-developed, highly populated area. North Africa, all along the coast here, from what is Carthage all the way over here through the Middle East, these are all economically advanced, except for Jerusalem and Israel, they were like an economic backwater. But the rest of this was all very economically powerful, lots of population, lots of people, and lots of the economy was strong. And then you have along the coast here of what's today Turkey, that was all very popular. And of course, the Greek areas were very advanced economically and from a population perspective. So the center of gravity of the empire from a political, from an economic perspective is east. Rome is actually way on the western edge. All this territory over here, which is today Western Europe, that was backwater, low population. They were barbarians. They were like, backwards. So that's not the center of the empire. So, and Constantine sees that. And so he moves the empire's capital to this. He builds a city called Constantinople, which today, of course, is Istanbul. Now, if you're going to pick a place to put a city, Constantinople is like S tier. Okay, that is like you got an A+ on your assignment. It is hitting a home run geographically because it is on water, major bodies of water. It's on this body of water here is called the Bosphorus that connects. This is the Black Sea today. We call it the Black Sea. This is, of course, the Mediterranean Sea. It connects those two bodies of water. So any trade going in and out of the Black Sea into the Mediterranean has to go through that little stretch. It's very narrow stretch of water. and it's very easily to close it off and defend it. So it's also like where you can make a lot of money off the trade going through there. It's also on the middle of the east-west trade routes. So the trade routes going here into what's today Europe, going east into what's today India, or even farther, those trade routes over land go right through the Bosphorus here. So this is a place that's like God tier. Like if you're playing Civilization and that's your starting position, you're like, thank you, Orange Jesus. Best starting spot ever. You're gonna win the game, no problem. Okay, that was probably none of you got that in. I'm sorry. I'll stop using video game. No, I won't. I'll never stop using video game analogies. I love my video game analogies, and you can't make me stop. Anyway, so that's why he moved it there, and he was right. Again, he was really smart dude. Constantinople later becomes Istanbul. Today, it's still one of the biggest and most influential cities of the world. So, smart move. But there will be consequences. Okay, that's everything I got today. Um, your homework, again, like I know it's not much. Just want you to think, just making Christianity legal, ending persecution, what is that going to do to the church?